Chapter 1. Nice suit. Would a snake wear such a nice suit? The scene opens with a flawless display of corporate infiltration. A young professional named Dave arrives at a rapidly growing high-tech firm for an interview, looking as though he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. Impeccably dressed and exuding a magnetic confidence, he immediately captivates the receptionist and draws the admiring gazes of the staff. His schedule is rigorous, involving meetings with a hiring manager named Frank, human resources personnel, and the vice president of the division. Yet Dave navigates each hurdle with effortless precision. When HR probes into his background, he is remarkably polite and endlessly accommodating. When he meets the vice president, he masterfully strokes the executive's ego, feigning deep admiration for the company's strategic vision while subtly mirroring the senior leader's own values of diligence and ambition. Dave is a chameleon, reflecting exactly what each interviewer desires in an ideal candidate. Frank, terrified of losing such a seemingly perfect prospect to a competitor, decides to bypass the company's standard protocol. Ignoring the human resources director's request for a collaborative review of the candidates, Frank takes Dave to lunch and offers him the position on the spot. Dave, leveraging his newly established influence, immediately negotiates a higher salary and a lucrative sign-on bonus. To the entire team, Dave appears to be a phenomenal acquisition, almost too good to be true. This scenario is increasingly common in modern business. As organizations accelerate their hiring processes to capture top talent in fiercely competitive markets, traditional vetting procedures are frequently abandoned. The rush to hire dynamic, take-charge individuals often blinds decision-makers to the reality of who they are actually inviting into their ranks, setting the stage for devastating consequences. The consequences of such unchecked hiring are vividly illustrated in the story of a financial services division driven to the brink of collapse by a psychopathic employee. The narrative unfolds in the back room of a local tavern, where a group of exhausted corporate employees are celebrating the sudden termination of their tyrannical boss, a woman they secretly referred to as the Pit Bull. For 2 years, the workplace had been a nightmare of emotional abuse and fear, a stark contrast to the company's original culture. The division had been built by an honorable executive affectionately known as Old Man Bailey. Bailey was a leader who valued his employees, knew their families, and fostered a culture of mutual respect and shared success. However, after selling his company to a massive corporate conglomerate, Bailey transitioned to a background consulting role, and the division's culture began to erode. The corporate headquarters eventually placed a young, status-driven manager named Gus in charge. Gus was highly susceptible to flattery, despised confrontation, and spent the majority of his time courting corporate executives rather than managing his team. Under his neglectful leadership, the division's performance plummeted, missing critical financial targets and teetering on the edge of a massive, humiliating government fine for regulatory non-compliance. Desperate to avert a public relations disaster, the corporate executive committee bypassed Bailey's advice and installed a seemingly brilliant internal candidate named Helen as the new director of operations. Helen was dynamic, energetic, and completely captivating during her interviews. She projected an aura of absolute certainty, convincing the executives that she was the aggressive savior needed to rescue the failing division. Granted a virtual blank check and unprecedented authority, Helen quickly produced results. Within 6 months, delivery performances skyrocketed, regulatory issues vanished, and the division appeared to be saved. Corporate leaders hailed her as a rising star, and she easily orchestrated Gus's departure, manipulating the executive board with a carefully crafted narrative that placed all the blame for the division's prior failures squarely on his shoulders. With Gus gone, Helen ascended to the top leadership role. Once in absolute power, the mask slipped. Helen unleashed a reign of psychological terror upon the staff. She ruled through intimidation and public humiliation, routinely berating experienced employees and treating junior staff with absolute contempt. She replaced vocal critics with her own hand-picked loyalists, lured by massive sign-on bonuses only to fire them weeks later on a whim, entirely unconcerned with the devastation she inflicted on their careers and families. She leased a lavish new office, demanded a corporate jet, and hosted extravagant, self-promoting conferences in tropical locations. Yet, to the corporate executives far removed from the daily operations, she continued to present a flawless illusion of success, meticulously stage-managing every interaction and forbidding her staff from speaking out of turn. Among her victims was a young, newly graduated accountant named Linda. Honest and naive, Linda became a frequent target of Helen's relentless hostility. Despite the protection of a senior auditor, Linda endured months of severe psychological distress. However, it was Linda's diligent auditing and quiet courage that eventually unraveled the illusion. The miraculous financial turnaround had been a complete fabrication. Helen, along with a close associate named Ned, had systematically created fictitious accounts to artificially inflate the division's performance while using her executive computer access to quietly siphon corporate assets into offshore bank accounts. When the authorities finally closed in, the illusion shattered. Ned was arrested in the company cafeteria, loudly demanding a lawyer. Helen, however, demonstrated the ultimate psychopathic contingency plan. Anticipating the collapse of her scheme, she slipped out the back door of her mansion, abandoned her corporate jet, and vanished on a private plane she had secretly kept fueled and ready at a local airstrip. Back at the tavern, the shattered employees try to piece their reality back together. The door opens and Old Man Bailey walks into the room. Bypassing the executives and managers, he walks directly over to the young accountant, Linda, sitting quietly in the corner. He thanks her profoundly for her honesty and her immense courage in the face of absolute corporate evil. As Bailey offers to buy a round of drinks for his traumatized former staff, the lingering question remains: how could an individual so deeply destructive, so fundamentally devoid of conscience and empathy, maneuver so easily into a position of absolute power? The answer lies in the unique predatory nature of the corporate psychopath, a predator who wears the finest suits and speaks the language of success, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin and shattered lives. Chapter 2. Who are these people? Novels, television, and film have conditioned us to view the psychopath in highly extreme, vivid, and terrifying ways. We picture the cold-blooded serial killer, the obsessive stalker, the ruthless con artist, or the brilliant, calculating supervillain. And while reality certainly provides harrowing examples that validate this dark image, the actual landscape of psychopathy is far more intricate and nuanced. Extensive research within prison populations unquestionably confirms the criminality and potential for violence associated with the term. We now understand that male and female psychopaths commit a broader range and a significantly higher number of crimes than the general criminal population. Their offenses tend to be more severe, characterized by an overarching theme of control, aggression, and abuse. Crucially, their violence is predatory, a cold-blooded calculation entirely devoid of the intense emotional turmoil that typically accompanies violent acts committed by ordinary people. This type of instrumental aggression is utilized simply as a means to an end, completely lacking any semblance of normal human concern for the suffering inflicted upon the victims. In stark contrast, the violence committed by non-psychopathic criminals is largely reactive. It is a response to a perceived threat or a situation that provokes an intense emotional outburst, often referred to as a crime of passion. Following such an event, the non-psychopathic individual is typically burdened by feelings of profound remorse and guilt for the damage they have caused. Perhaps the most alarming reality from a public safety standpoint is that psychopathic offenders recidivate at a much higher and faster rate than other criminals. They represent a distinct minority of the prison population, yet they are responsible for an outsized portion of serious, persistent crime. However, it is essential to understand that not all criminals are psychopaths, and conversely, not all psychopaths end up pursuing a life of overt criminality. This complexity frequently leads to confusion surrounding the specific distinctions between psychopathy, sociopathy, and antisocial personality disorder. While the general public, and even some professionals, often use these terms interchangeably, they actually describe related but distinct conditions. Psychopathy is a formal personality disorder defined by a specific cluster of traits and behaviors. Those afflicted are fundamentally without conscience, completely incapable of experiencing genuine empathy, guilt, or loyalty to anyone other than themselves. Sociopathy, by contrast, is not a formal psychiatric diagnosis. Instead, it refers to patterns of behavior and attitudes that society at large deems criminal or antisocial, but which are considered normal or entirely necessary within the specific subculture or environment where the individual was raised. Sociopaths may possess a very well-developed conscience and hold a normal capacity for empathy and loyalty, but their internal moral compass is calibrated to the expectations of their specific group, rather than society as a whole. Antisocial personality disorder is a broad diagnostic category where criminal and antisocial behaviors are the primary defining factors. While it shares similarities with sociopathy, it is fundamentally different from psychopathy. An individual can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder without possessing the specific personality traits, such as grandiosity, shallow emotions, and a profound lack of empathy, that are absolutely required for a diagnosis of psychopathy. In fact, antisocial personality disorder is significantly more common in the general population than psychopathy. It could be argued that the psychopaths living freely among us simply have not yet been caught committing a crime. Given their inherent inclination to push boundaries and flout societal rules, this argument holds weight. However, possessing a psychopathic personality does not automatically mandate criminal behavior. Many psychopaths maneuver through society without technically breaking the law, although they often skirt its very edges. They can lead seemingly normal lives while leaving a hidden trail of economic, psychological, and emotional devastation in their wake. They do not form warm, loving bonds with family or friends. Instead, they often adopt a parasitic lifestyle, bleeding dry the generosity and trust of those around them. You may very well know someone like this, a neighbor, a co-worker, or even a family member, whose behavior is simultaneously fascinating, baffling, and deeply repellent. The early attempts by psychiatrists to accurately diagnose this condition were hindered by vague criteria. However, over the past 50 years, psychopathy has become one of the most rigorously researched and clearly understood psychological constructs. The pioneering work of Dr. Hare in the late 1930s laid the foundation. By closely observing psychiatric patients who did not exhibit traditional symptoms of mental illness, Cleckley recognized a profound underlying disorder. These individuals were highly intelligent and superficially charming, yet they constantly made disastrous life choices, learned nothing from experience, and lacked any genuine capacity for remorse, shame, or deep emotional connection. They were consummate, seamless liars who presented a flawless illusion of normalcy to the world, masking an incredibly destructive core. Building upon these observations, later researchers developed standardized, scientifically rigorous assessment tools. By measuring physiological responses to emotional language, researchers discovered that psychopathic individuals simply do not process emotional content in the same way normal people do. To them, highly charged emotional words carry no more weight than mundane, neutral terms. This chilling reality led to the creation of the gold standard for measuring this condition, a comprehensive diagnostic instrument that evaluates 20 specific interpersonal, emotional, and lifestyle traits. Understanding this profound emotional poverty inevitably leads to the question of origins. Is this deeply destructive personality the result of genetics, or is it shaped by a toxic environment? The answer is a complex interplay of both nature and nurture. However, recent advancements in behavioral genetics have provided compelling evidence that genetic factors play a massively significant role in the development of core psychopathic features. Large-scale studies involving twins have consistently demonstrated a strong genetic contribution to the defining traits of psychopathy, particularly when callous and unemotional traits are combined with antisocial behavior. This does not mean that a person's destiny is entirely fixed from birth, but it does indicate that the social environment faces a monumental uphill battle to overcome the biological blueprint. The fundamental building blocks required for a normal human conscience, the capacity to connect emotionally with others and to experience the full spectrum of feelings, including empathy and fear, are severely diminished from the start. To use a simple metaphor, while the environment acts as the potter shaping the clay, the ultimate nature of the pottery is heavily dependent on the specific quality of the clay that nature has provided. To truly grasp the mechanics of this condition, psychologists break down the psychopathic personality into 4 distinct domains. The interpersonal domain encompasses how these individuals present themselves to the world, typically as superficially charming, grandiose, and highly deceitful. The affective domain focuses on their profound emotional deficits, a complete lack of remorse, a glaring absence of empathy, and a steadfast refusal to accept responsibility for their actions. The lifestyle domain highlights their chaotic existence, marked by impulsivity, a lack of realistic long-term goals, and chronic irresponsibility. Finally, the antisocial domain reflects their history of poor behavioral controls and a consistent pattern of violating societal norms, stretching from adolescence into adulthood. Through functional brain imaging, modern science has actually observed these deficits in real time. When exposed to emotional imagery or language, the psychopathic brain fails to activate the regions normally associated with emotional processing. Instead, they analyze the material purely intellectually, processing emotional events through the linguistic centers of the brain. They know the words, but they are entirely deaf to the music. When confronted with this detailed breakdown of psychopathic traits, it is an entirely common human reaction to experience a sudden flash of self-doubt or anxiety. We might recognize that a friend is wildly impulsive, or that we ourselves occasionally act irresponsibly, and immediately jump to alarming conclusions. However, possessing one or two of these traits does not equate to psychopathy. The condition exists on a multidimensional continuum, much like human blood pressure. At the extreme high end of this spectrum are the true psychopaths. Individuals carrying a dense, heavy concentration of the interpersonal, affective, and lifestyle deficits that strictly define the disorder. The vast majority of humanity falls comfortably toward the lower end of this scale. Those situated in the middle may display a significant number of psychopathic features, manifesting as fiercely ambitious, highly entitled, or notoriously difficult individuals. Yet they do not meet the clinical criteria for psychopathy. Their behavior depends entirely on their specific mix of traits. But they are not the invisible predators walking among us, wearing a tailored mask to camouflage a hollow, remorseless core. Chapter 3. What you see may not be what you see. The ink is barely dry on the employment contract before Dave hits the ground running in his new corporate home. The initial excitement of his grand entrance transitions swiftly into an aggressive, calculated campaign of establishing territory. Frank, the hiring manager who expedited Dave's arrival, watches with pride as his new protege effortlessly navigates the office landscape. Dave seems to be everywhere at once, scheduling introductory lunches with key executives, lingering in the break room to charm the administrative staff, and subtly inserting himself into high-profile projects. To Frank and the executive team, Dave is a self-starter, a visionary aggressively tackling his mandate. Yet beneath this veneer of corporate zeal, a very different mechanism is at work. Dave is not building a professional network. He is meticulously cataloging a hunting ground, identifying who holds the keys to power and who presents a potential threat to his ascent. To comprehend the sheer effectiveness of this infiltration, it is crucial to untangle the complex web of traits that drive such behavior. In the modern workplace, difficult personalities are often lumped together under broad, imprecise labels. Chief among these points of confusion is the relationship between psychopathy and narcissism. While the two share overlapping characteristics, primarily a deep-seated grandiosity and a lack of genuine empathy, their fundamental motivations are vastly different. A narcissist is driven by an insatiable, desperate need for validation, admiration, and attention. They must be the smartest person in the room, and they require everyone else to acknowledge it. Their ego is massive, yet exceedingly fragile. A psychopath, conversely, possesses a chillingly self-contained ego. They do not care if you like them, admire them, or respect them, unless your opinion can be directly leveraged for their personal gain. If playing the fool, the victim, or the obedient servant secures the desired outcome, the psychopath will effortlessly adopt that role without a single bruising to their self-esteem. They are not seeking an audience to applaud their greatness. They are seeking targets from whom they can extract resources, power, or entertainment. This brings us to their overarching philosophy, the manipulative approach to life. For the psychopathic personality, human interaction is entirely transactional. The complex social contracts that bind normal society, trust, reciprocity, mutual respect, and honesty, are completely invisible to them. Instead, the world is viewed as a zero-sum game of predators and prey. They recognize early in life that other people experience deep, binding emotions and adhere to moral boundaries. Rather than viewing this as a standard to aspire to, they view the conscience of others as a highly predictable vulnerability to be exploited. By completely detaching from the moral framework that governs human society, they embrace a chilling paradox: when bad is good. In the psychopathic lifestyle, the behaviors that society universally condemns are transformed into highly efficient tools. Deceit is not a shameful failure of character. It is a vital mechanism for controlling the narrative. Betrayal is not a tragic severing of bonds. It is a necessary pivot when a relationship no longer yields a high return on investment. By completely freeing themselves from the heavy, restraining anchors of guilt and remorse, they are able to move through life with a terrifying, unencumbered velocity. This predatory velocity is not random. It is highly structured, unfolding in 3 distinct stages. The first is the assessment phase. When entering a new environment, whether a corporate office or a private social gathering, the psychopath conducts a rapid, intensely focused inventory of every individual present. They are looking for 2 specific things: utility and vulnerability. Utility refers to what the target can provide: money, influence, access to power, or a protective shield against scrutiny. Vulnerability refers to the target's psychological needs. Are they lonely? Are they insecure about their age or intelligence? Are they desperate for a mentor or a savior? The ideal target possesses a high degree of utility and a profound, easily exploitable vulnerability. This assessment is heavily amplified when an organization is undergoing severe structural change. Chaos represents the psychopath's greatest opportunity. During corporate mergers, downsizing, or rapid expansion, normal reporting structures fracture. Oversight diminishes as management scrambles to put out fires. Anxiety among employees skyrockets. In this fog of war, the psychopath thrives. While normal employees are paralyzed by uncertainty, the psychopath seizes the vacuum of leadership, leveraging the chaos to mask their power grabs and deflect accountability. Once a target has been selected and assessed, the trap is set. This initiates the manipulation phase. Having identified the target's deepest psychological needs, the psychopath meticulously crafts a bespoke persona designed to perfectly fulfill those needs. If the target desires a fierce protector, the psychopath projects unyielding strength. If the target is seeking a sympathetic confidant, the psychopath mirrors their pain and offers a shoulder to cry on. They are ultimate chameleons, weaving a web of manufactured rapport so thick and intoxicating that the target willingly surrenders their resources, their trust, and their critical judgment. History is replete with masters of this phase, perhaps most famously illustrated by the exploits of individuals who assume entirely fabricated identities to defraud the elite. Consider the case of the man who successfully convinced high society that he was a vital part of the French branch of the Rockefellers. Operating in exclusive circles, he did not rely on brute force. He relied on the greed and vanity of his victims. He recognized that wealthy, ambitious individuals were desperate to be associated with legendary old money. By projecting the exact aura of casual wealth and aristocratic entitlement that his victims expected, he bypassed their defenses entirely. He offered them phantom investment opportunities, leveraging their own desire for prestige against them, effortlessly separating them from millions. The success of such grand deceptions relies heavily on timing. A core tenet of psychopathic manipulation is to hit them when they're down. A target who is emotionally stable, surrounded by a strong support system, and feeling confident is incredibly difficult to manipulate. Therefore, the psychopath actively seeks out individuals who are experiencing significant life transitions or emotional turmoil. A recent divorce, the death of a loved one, a sudden career setback. These crises create deep psychological wounds. The psychopath inserts themselves directly into the wound, offering a potent temporary anesthetic of absolute support and validation, completely blinding the victim to the extraction of their assets. Eventually, the well runs dry. The target's financial resources are exhausted, their political capital within the organization is spent, or they begin to ask uncomfortable questions. This triggers the final, and often most devastating stage, the abandonment phase. For the victim, the relationship was deeply profound and emotionally binding. For the psychopath, it was purely mechanical. Once the utility drops to zero, the manufactured persona instantly evaporates. The charming, attentive ally vanishes, replaced by an entity of chilling, absolute indifference. The target is discarded without a shred of hesitation or remorse, left in a state of profound psychological shock, completely unable to reconcile the idealized illusion they loved with the cold predator who just walked away. This level of devastating efficiency is rarely innate. Practice makes perfect. Psychopaths are constantly honing their craft. Early in their careers, they may make clumsy errors, overplaying their hand or pushing a target too aggressively. However, unburdened by the emotional fallout of their failures, they treat every interaction as a learning opportunity. They refine their ability to read micro-expressions, they polish their linguistic skills, and they learn exactly which buttons to push to short-circuit human logic. Over time, they evolve into apex social predators, leaving almost zero margin for error. This refined predation is perhaps most horrifying when it infiltrates environments built on absolute faith. The most devastating examples often occur when these individuals don the robes of authority and demand that their victims praise the Lord. Religious and charitable organizations are constructed entirely on a foundation of trust, forgiveness, and the assumption of inherent goodness. To a psychopath, this is not a sanctuary, it is an unprotected vault. By adopting the language of salvation and weaponizing the very tenets of faith, they construct an impenetrable shield against criticism. Any attempt to question their financial irregularities or abusive behavior is instantly reframed as a spiritual attack, weaponizing the congregation against the very individuals trying to protect them. The suit they wear may change, from corporate pinstripes to religious vestments, but the cold, calculating void beneath remains exactly the same. Chapter 4. Psychopathic Manipulation. How did he do that? The narrative resumes in the bustling corridor of the corporate headquarters, where Dave orchestrates a seemingly chance encounter with Frank, the manager who championed his hiring. With a warm, infectious smile and a perfectly timed compliment about a recent presentation, Dave effortlessly breaks the ice. Frank, flattered and eager to mentor his rising star, invites Dave into his office for a private chat. The moment Dave crosses the threshold, his eyes conduct a rapid, forensic sweep of the room. He ignores the corporate awards and focuses entirely on the personal artifacts: a golf trophy, a framed diploma, and prominently a photograph of Frank with his teenage daughter. Dave carefully steers the conversation, asking gentle, open-ended questions until Frank eventually voices a deep-seated anxiety regarding his daughter's struggles with college admissions and the impending financial burden. Without missing a beat, Dave's posture softens. His voice drops to a tone of intimate empathy. He invents a profoundly moving, entirely fictitious story about his own sister's arduous battle with the college admissions process, mirroring Frank's exact fears and frustrations. He validates Frank's stress, assuring him that his feelings are justified and that he is a remarkably dedicated father. In the span of a 20-minute conversation, Frank's perception of Dave shifts dramatically. Dave is no longer just a talented new hire. He is a confidant, a kindred spirit who understands Frank on a deeply personal level. Frank feels a profound sense of relief and connection. When observing such interactions, one might wonder if manipulative behavior is simply a universal human trait. It is a fair observation that nearly everyone engages in some form of social maneuvering. We smile at a police officer hoping to avoid a traffic ticket, we feign enthusiasm for a deeply uninteresting gift to spare a relative's feelings, and we strategically highlight our best qualities during a job interview. This everyday social lubrication is driven by a desire to avoid conflict, protect relationships, or achieve minor personal goals. However, equating this normal, mild manipulation with the calculated predation of a psychopath is a dangerous misunderstanding. Everyday manipulation is tempered by a functioning conscience, a capacity for guilt, and a fundamental respect for the autonomy of others. The manipulation orchestrated in Frank's office is a different species of behavior entirely. It is a ruthless, remorseless extraction of trust, completely devoid of any genuine human warmth. Frank walked away from that conversation feeling a deep emotional resonance, completely unaware that the interaction was entirely one-sided. Where Frank felt a bond, Dave felt absolutely nothing. The psychopathic emotional landscape is profoundly barren. To Dave, the conversation was not an exchange of vulnerabilities. It was a mechanical data-gathering exercise. Because they are incapable of experiencing the rich, complex tapestry of human emotion, psychopaths study the emotional reactions of others the way a scientist observes a subject in a laboratory. They learn the exact facial expressions, the precise vocal inflections, and the appropriate body language required to simulate empathy, sorrow, or joy. They know the lyrics to the song of human connection, but they are entirely deaf to the music. To understand how this illusion is maintained so flawlessly, one must examine the architecture of human personality. Psychologists often describe personality as having distinct layers. There is the public self, the carefully curated persona we present to colleagues and acquaintances. Beneath that is the private self, the more vulnerable identity we share only with trusted friends and family. Finally, there is the core self, the fundamental truth of who we are when no one is watching. In a psychologically healthy individual, these layers are generally aligned. The public mask may be more polished, but it is deeply connected to the core identity. In the psychopathic personality, this alignment does not exist. Their core is defined by an absolute chilling emptiness and a predatory drive. Therefore, their public self is not a reflection of their true identity. It is a meticulously constructed, highly adaptable mask. This mask is rendered impenetrable by the psychopath's innate psychological advantages. They utilize whatever natural tools they possess, often superior verbal fluency, a quick wit, and a captivating physical presence. But their most powerful weapon is the complete absence of social anxiety or fear of judgment. When a normal person tells a complex lie, their body betrays them. Their heart rate elevates, they may sweat, their eye contact falters, and their voice might waver. This physiological friction is the byproduct of a conscience in conflict. The psychopath experiences no such friction. Because they feel no guilt and possess no fear of consequence, their delivery is absolute perfection. They can look a target directly in the eyes and deliver a devastating lie with the calm, steady heartbeat of a resting athlete. This physiological calm allows them to initiate the next critical phase of their strategy, forging the psychopathic bond. The interaction in Frank's office was not an isolated event. It was the pouring of a foundation. This artificial bond is designed to feel completely intoxicating to the victim. It bypasses logical defenses by appealing directly to the ego and the target's unfulfilled emotional voids. The psychopath acts as a perfect mirror, reflecting back exactly what the target desperately wants to see. The target believes they have discovered an unparalleled ally, a soulmate, or a fiercely loyal subordinate. They are entirely blind to the reality that this intense, hyper-focused attention is merely the tightening of a snare. Once this bond is established, the scope of the manipulation expands exponentially. The psychopath does not limit their influence to a single individual. They operate as a shadow puppet master across the entire organization. They map the complex network of rivalries, alliances, and insecurities within the office. With surgical precision, they begin managing the flow of information. They will feed a confidential, subtly altered story to one executive and a completely contradictory narrative to another, ensuring that the two targets never compare notes. They deliberately manufacture conflicts between colleagues, watching from the periphery as the team fractures. Then, possessing the absolute trust of all involved, they position themselves as the indispensable peacemaker, the only rational voice in a sea of chaos they secretly created. The ultimate success of the puppet master relies heavily on a chilling ability to give their targets exactly what they want. The psychopath understands that every human being is driven by specific, often hidden, desires. Some are driven by unfulfilled ambition and a desperate need for power. Others are driven by an overwhelming fear of irrelevance or a crushing sense of loneliness. Some are simply driven by pure financial greed. Once the psychopath identifies this core driver, they become the ultimate, exclusive provider of that desire. They trade in potent illusions, offering the promise of wealth, unyielding loyalty, or exponential career advancement. In exchange for these phantom gifts, the victim willingly surrenders their resources, compromises their ethics, and actively facilitates the psychopath's ascent, entirely unaware that they are eagerly participating in their own destruction. Chapter 5. Enter the psychopath, stage left. The corporate offices are silent, bathed in the pale, artificial glow of security lights. Dorothy, a highly motivated marketing associate, sits hunched over her laptop, deeply engrossed in the data of a secret, unauthorized initiative, a skunkworks project she hopes will define her career. The building is empty, or so she believes, until a voice suddenly shatters the quiet. Dave leans casually against the doorframe, remarking on her late hours. He enters her workspace uninvited, attempting to peer at her screen. When Dorothy defensively blocks his view, Dave feigns injury, reminding her of their morning coffees and the supposed trust they share. With surgical precision, he shifts the tone from playful banter to calculated paternalism. He subtly undermines her confidence, warning her that the senior manager, Frank, is a political roadblock who will inevitably crush her ideas out of professional jealousy. Dave paints the corporate landscape as a hostile political battlefield, offering himself as an essential ally. He suggests that one hand washes the other, attempting to force a partnership where none is needed. It is a masterful, quiet intrusion, a perfect microcosm of the predator, testing the perimeter fences of a new target. To fully comprehend the mechanics of this infiltration, one must observe how these predators operate in environments constructed entirely on trust. Consider the devastating aftermath in the basement of a local church, where the collections committee sits in stunned silence. The mortgage check has bounced, the restoration fund is entirely depleted. Sam, the charismatic, deeply devout new treasurer, has vanished without a trace. Months earlier, Sam had arrived at the parish projecting the aura of a man seeking spiritual redemption. He told a heart-wrenching, entirely fabricated story of a high-flying investment banking career abandoned after the tragic death of his wife and child. He threw himself into volunteer work, projecting unwavering sincerity and boundless generosity. Relying on his apparent financial acumen, parishioners eagerly sought his advice, eventually entrusting him with their personal life savings and the church's financial future. Sam was a practitioner of affinity fraud, a devastating manipulation tactic where the predator adopts the shared beliefs, values, and cultural markers of a specific group to gain absolute, unquestioned acceptance. Religious congregations, cultural associations, and tightly knit social groups are highly vulnerable because their foundational premise is mutual trust and the assumption of inherent goodness. When a newcomer arrives speaking the exact language of their faith and mirroring their deepest values, the group's collective defenses drop. The psychopath hides within this sanctuary of assumed morality. Interestingly, in almost every instance of affinity fraud, a consistent pattern emerges. Roughly 1/3 of the group is completely charmed and fiercely loyal to the predator. Another third feels an inexplicable, lingering suspicion, finding the individual physically repulsive or untrustworthy without concrete evidence. The final third remains neutral. Even after the devastating betrayal is fully exposed by law enforcement, many in the charmed faction will stubbornly refuse to accept reality, desperately clinging to the illusion of the benevolent savior they thought they knew. That inexplicable suspicion felt by the dissenting third is not merely a social preference. It is a profound physiological reaction. When interviewing and interacting with psychopathic individuals, seasoned investigators and mental health professionals frequently report severe autonomic responses. They describe feeling a sudden chill, a queasy stomach, a pounding heart, and the profound sensation that their skin is crawling. They describe looking into eyes that are completely empty, possessing a cold, predatory stare. These physical reactions are the human body's primitive, instinctual alarm system activating. The subconscious mind recognizes that it is in the presence of a cold-blooded, intraspecies predator, and the autonomic nervous system triggers a fight-or-flight response, leaving the observer with the chilling sensation that they are about to become prey. While religious and social groups offer easy pickings, the modern business organization presents the ultimate high-stakes hunting ground. The corporate landscape is fundamentally different from a community group. It is heavily structured, driven by profit, and regulated by complex policies. In theory, a traditional rigid bureaucracy should act as an impenetrable fortress against a psychopath. A heavily bureaucratized company relies on strict reporting structures, tedious team consensus, and aggressive oversight by auditing, security, and human resources departments. A psychopath who is fundamentally irresponsible, parasitic, and incapable of genuine teamwork or long-term dedication would quickly suffocate in such a heavily policed, monotonous environment. However, the reality of modern business has shifted dramatically. To survive in a hyper-competitive global market, companies have intentionally dismantled their rigid bureaucracies. They have flattened hierarchies, removed layers of management oversight, and embraced constant, chaotic change to foster rapid innovation. It is within this transitional, fast-paced corporate chaos that the corporate psychopath thrives. The confusion of restructuring and the desperate corporate desire for aggressive, rule-breaking change agents provide the perfect camouflage for a predator whose entire existence is based on manipulation and a blatant disregard for boundaries. The devastating impact of this infiltration is vividly illustrated in a consulting case involving a highly prestigious, rapidly failing project team. The team was paralyzed by internal conflict, missed deadlines, and plummeting morale. Upon investigation, a bizarre, deeply polarized picture emerged of one specific team member. A faction of the team, along with several high-ranking executives, viewed this individual as a brilliant, innovative leader and the undeniable future of the company. However, the other half of the team, speaking only under strict promises of confidentiality, described a nightmare. They detailed a pattern of relentless bullying, credit theft, chronic absenteeism, and pathological lying. When organizational investigators finally dug into the individual's background, the reality was staggering. His resume was a complete fabrication built on fake degrees from non-existent institutions. Internal audits revealed systematic expense account fraud and the blatant theft of valuable company property. The evidence of his deceit was overwhelming and irrefutable. Yet, before the organizational police could initiate termination, senior management intervened. In a sweeping corporate reorganization, the targeted team was disbanded. The exposed fraudster was not fired. Instead, protected by the powerful executives he had successfully charmed and manipulated, he was promoted into a major leadership role, rewarded for the very ruthlessness that was destroying the company from within. This predatory adaptability is not limited by gender, though it is frequently obscured by societal bias. A dangerous myth persists that psychopathy is an exclusively male disorder, manifesting only as physical aggression or overt dominance. Consequently, when female psychopaths display the exact same core traits, grandiosity, deceit, callousness, and an absolute lack of empathy, they are frequently misdiagnosed with histrionic or narcissistic disorders. This diagnostic blind spot occurs because society conditions us to expect specific behaviors from men and women. The female psychopath understands these cultural expectations perfectly and weaponizes them. She may seamlessly adopt the mask of the passive, nurturing, or desperately dependent victim to effortlessly extract resources and manipulate her targets. She uses the societal assumption of female vulnerability as an impenetrable shield, operating with the exact same cold-blooded, parasitic devastation as her male counterparts, leaving a trail of shattered lives and ruined careers while the world looks the other way. The ultimate question remains: how do these predators effortlessly bypass the sophisticated security checkpoints of the corporate hiring process? The answer lies in the fundamental flaws of human assessment. While lower-level positions require quantifiable technical skills that are easily verified, senior leadership roles demand intangible qualities, strategic vision, charisma, and the elusive concept of leadership potential. As a result, executive hiring decisions frequently abandon rigorous vetting in favor of chemistry and gut feeling. This is the exact arena where the psychopath holds absolute supremacy. They know that a staggering percentage of modern resumes contain falsehoods, so they do not hesitate to submit documents that are works of pure, unadulterated fiction, complete with fabricated awards and glowing self-written recommendations. When they enter the interview room, they do not participate in a professional evaluation. They execute a flawless, highly calibrated theatrical performance. Unburdened by the nervous anxiety that plagues an honest candidate, they project absolute, unwavering confidence. They mirror the hiring manager's exact desires, speaking the language of aggressive innovation and decisive action. They weave captivating, grandiose stories of non-existent past triumphs, completely dazzling the interviewers. By expertly pushing the buttons of corporate ambition and exploiting the desperate need for a charismatic savior, the psychopath walks through the front door, warmly welcomed and richly compensated by the very organization they are about to consume. Chapter 6. Pawns, Patrons, and Patsies. The atmosphere within the division begins to shift, marked by an insidious, creeping sense of panic that infects the lower ranks of the organization while the upper echelons remain completely oblivious. The initial euphoria surrounding Dave's arrival has evaporated for those working alongside him. Deadlines are suddenly missed, critical files vanish, and fierce, uncharacteristic arguments erupt between previously collaborative team members. A toxic fog of paranoia settles over the office. Yet, whenever the escalating chaos threatens to breach the executive floor, Dave effortlessly intercepts it. He steps in with a perfectly calibrated display of concern, subtly suggesting to upper management that the current team is deeply flawed, resistant to change, and utterly reliant on his steady hand to prevent a total collapse. He is not merely surviving the turmoil, he is conducting it. This orchestrated chaos is the direct result of a carefully constructed illusion, often referred to as the psychopathic fiction. To the corporate psychopath, The workplace is not a community of colleagues striving toward a shared goal. It is a grand theatrical production, a complex drama entirely written, directed, and starring themselves. Every other individual within the organization is merely a prop or a supporting actor assigned a highly specific role based entirely on their immediate utility. The psychopath assesses the organizational chart not to understand reporting lines but to map a battlefield. They conduct a relentless, silent audit of human capital, categorizing every employee into distinct groups to build an impenetrable power base. The most critical supporting characters in this drama are the patrons. These are high-level executives, influential board members, or seasoned managers like Frank. The psychopath recognizes immediately that true power in a corporation flows from the top down, and therefore, securing a powerful protector is the ultimate priority. The manipulation of a patron is a masterclass in upward management. The psychopath studies the patron's specific insecurities, their unfulfilled career aspirations, and their blind spots. They then construct a bespoke persona designed to be the patron's perfect subordinate, brilliant, aggressively loyal, and entirely deferential. The psychopath acts as a fierce guardian of the patron's reputation, whispering praises in public while secretly filtering the information the patron receives. By becoming indispensable, the psychopath ensures that the patron will reflexively defend them against any criticism from below, effectively using the patron's established authority as an impenetrable shield. Beneath the patrons exist the pawns. These are the everyday co-workers, the administrative staff, and the mid-level managers who handle the actual, tangible work of the organization. Because the psychopath is fundamentally averse to genuine labor, they must trick others into carrying their workload. They recruit pawns through manufactured charm, false promises of future promotions, or by creating an illusion of an exclusive inner circle alliance. Pawns are utilized to gather office gossip, to execute tedious administrative tasks, and to serve as a buffer between the psychopath and any actual responsibilities. When a pawn is no longer useful, or when they begin to ask uncomfortable questions about stolen credit or missing funds, they are instantly discarded, their reputations quietly assassinated by the psychopath before they even realize they are under attack. Inevitably, the psychopath's chaotic lifestyle, their lack of actual skills, and their penchant for rule-breaking lead to severe organizational failures. When the financial discrepancies emerge or the massive project collapses, the psychopath must have a designated scapegoat ready. These individuals are the patsies. A patsy is often a highly competent, deeply conscientious employee who was deliberately positioned by the psychopath to take the fall. The psychopath will slowly and methodically alter the paper trail, forge emails, and manipulate project timelines so that when the catastrophic failure is finally discovered, all evidence points directly to the patsy. The psychopath will then step forward, feigning deep sorrow and betrayal, to mournfully inform the patron of the patsy's tragic incompetence, completely insulating themselves from the blast radius of their own destruction. However, not everyone in the organization falls neatly into these three categories. There are low-utility observers, individuals who possess no real power, no access to valuable resources, and no significant vulnerability. Because they offer no return on investment, the psychopath simply ignores them. To these observers, the psychopath often appears entirely unremarkable, just another passing face in the corporate hallway. Far more dangerous to the psychopath's survival are the detractors. These are the rare individuals who remain immune to the charm offensive. They see the mask slip, they notice the pathological lying, the subtle cruelties, and the glaring inconsistencies in the psychopath's grand narratives. The detractor attempts to sound the alarm, to warn human resources or upper management about the predator in their midst. But they are almost never believed. The psychopath, anticipating this threat, has already poisoned the well. Long before the detractor can voice a complaint, the psychopath has subtly suggested to the patron that the detractor is mentally unstable, fiercely jealous, or aggressively undermining the company's vision. When the detractor finally speaks up, their warnings are dismissed as the bitter complaints of a problematic employee, and they frequently find themselves isolated, disciplined, or terminated. The ultimate threat to the psychopath is the organizational police, the auditors, the security personnel, and the human resources investigators. These individuals operate on hard data, strict policies, and verifiable facts, making them highly resistant to emotional manipulation. To survive them, the psychopath relies almost entirely on the protective cover of their patron. When an auditor raises a red flag regarding the psychopath's expense reports, the psychopath does not argue with the auditor, they bypass them entirely. They run to their patron, framing the audit as a bureaucratic witch hunt designed to stifle innovation. The patron, heavily invested in the illusion of their star protégé, uses their executive clout to shut down the investigation, inadvertently becoming an active accomplice to corporate fraud. This complex web of manipulation ultimately fractures the reality of the workplace, resulting in violently discrepant views of the same individual. The patrons view the psychopath as a visionary genius and a loyal friend. The pawns view them as a demanding but charismatic leader. The patsies and detractors view them as a terrifying, destructive monster. These groups exist in the same building, yet they inhabit entirely different realities, making it nearly impossible for the organization to form a unified defense. Eventually, the weight of the accumulated lies, the stolen funds, and the shattered teams becomes too immense to conceal. The psychopathic fiction begins to collapse, but the psychopath never stays to face the music. At the first sign of a genuine, unavoidable confrontation, they initiate the abandonment phase. They do not attempt to apologize or rebuild, they simply pack up their desk and vanish, leaving the patrons, pawns, and patsies to sift through the smoldering wreckage of their careers, completely bewildered by the sudden disappearance of the star they thought they knew. Chapter 7. Darkness and Chaos. The tension in the executive conference room is palpable, thick with unspoken accusations and defensive posturing. Two senior directors, normally collaborative and cordial, are locked in a bitter, escalating dispute over a critical misallocation of departmental funds. The catalyst for this sudden eruption of hostility is a single, ambiguously worded financial memo, a document routed to the wrong department by Dave. When summoned into the crossfire to explain the discrepancy, Dave presents a flawless picture of professional contrition. He bows his head slightly, his voice laden with perfectly calibrated regret, and characterizes the misrouted document as an unfortunate but entirely honest mistake. He subtly reminds the directors of the crushing workload generated by the company's recent restructuring efforts, playing on their shared exhaustion. The directors, overwhelmed by the broader organizational turmoil and disarmed by Dave's apparent humility, immediately wave off his apology. They redirect their fury squarely at one another, completely missing the fact that the fire consuming their partnership was intentionally set. Dave quietly excuses himself from the room, leaving the chaos to burn while he walks back to his office, entirely unscathed and secretly energized. To the ordinary professional, a predictable, stable, and transparent work environment is the ultimate ideal. Stability fosters trust, allows for long-term planning, and creates a sense of psychological safety where employees can perform at their highest capacity. To the corporate psychopath, however, stability is suffocating. A calm, well-ordered organization relies on accountability, routine audits, clear reporting lines, and open communication. These are the very mechanisms designed to expose deceit, track performance, and illuminate hidden agendas. In a healthy corporate ecosystem, the psychopath's chronic lack of actual productivity, their parasitic tendencies, and their manipulative maneuvers would quickly be brought to light. Therefore, to survive and ultimately thrive, the psychopath must seek out or actively manufacture two essential environmental conditions: darkness and chaos. In the context of an organization, darkness is not merely the absence of light. It is the deliberate absence of communication. It is a culture defined by secrecy, heavily siloed departments, and closed-door decision-making. The psychopath is an apex predator of the information gap. When departments do not communicate with one another, the psychopath steps in to serve as the sole, highly contaminated conduit between them. They recognize that if the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing, they can easily manipulate both. Operating in this darkness, the psychopath controls the narrative with absolute impunity. They will approach one executive with a completely fabricated story regarding a rival department's intentions, stoking paranoia and defensive posturing. They will then cross the building and deliver a perfectly mirrored, equally false narrative to the rival department. Because the organization's culture discourages direct, transparent, cross-departmental verification, the lie goes unchecked. The psychopath effectively builds invisible walls between colleagues, isolating them into vulnerable pockets of ignorance. By strictly controlling what people know, the psychopath dictates how they react, turning highly competent professionals into unwitting pieces on a chessboard hidden entirely in the shadows. While darkness provides the cover for their maneuvers, chaos provides the necessary momentum. Chaos in the modern business world takes many forms: massive corporate mergers, hostile acquisitions, aggressive downsizing, rapid expansion into unverified markets, or sudden, sweeping changes in executive leadership. For the vast majority of the workforce, these events are deeply traumatic. Chaos shatters the established social order of the office. Normal employees experience a profound spike in anxiety regarding their job security, their changing responsibilities, and their shifting alliances. Morale plummets, productivity grinds to a halt, and the collective focus of the workforce shifts inward toward sheer survival. The psychopath, entirely immune to this emotional turbulence, experiences the exact opposite reaction. They are invigorated by the structural collapse. During periods of intense organizational chaos, the traditional rules of engagement are temporarily suspended. Human resources departments are overwhelmed with severance packages and integration logistics, leaving them no time to conduct thorough background checks or investigate nuanced behavioral complaints. Senior management is entirely consumed with putting out massive, systemic fires and appeasing terrified shareholders, blinding them to the granular, interpersonal dynamics of their staff. In this chaotic vacuum, the psychopath moves with terrifying speed and efficiency. They immediately recognize that desperate organizations are highly susceptible to the illusion of bold, decisive leadership. Consequently, the psychopath effortlessly adopts the persona of the aggressive change agent. They present themselves to overwhelmed executives as the only individual willing to make the tough, unsentimental decisions necessary to steer the ship through the storm. Under the guise of necessary restructuring, the psychopath begins a ruthless, highly systematic purge. They do not target the underperforming or redundant employees. They target their personal detractors and anyone who possesses the institutional knowledge or critical thinking skills required to expose them. They frame these terminations as essential cost-cutting measures or necessary steps to eliminate resistance to change. The distracted executives, desperate for someone to handle the unpleasant realities of the transition, rubber-stamp these decisions without a second thought. The psychopath is effectively handed a loaded weapon and full immunity, using the cover of corporate upheaval to aggressively dismantle any threat to their power base. The most chilling aspect of this dynamic is that if a psychopath finds themselves in an organization that is too stable, too transparent, and too healthy, they will not simply leave. They will actively manufacture the chaos they require. They are the organizational equivalent of an arsonist who sets a building on fire specifically so they can be the first to arrive with a bucket of water, demanding to be hailed as a hero. They manufacture this turmoil through subtle, relentless sabotage. They will strategically misplace critical files just before a major presentation, ensuring a highly visible, humiliating failure for a rival. They will casually drop incendiary rumors about impending layoffs into the company grapevine, watching with clinical detachment as panic paralyzes an entire division. They will pit ambitious executives against one another by feeding them contradictory instructions, sparking bitter, energy-draining turf wars. As the organization slowly descends into a state of panic and infighting, the psychopath remains the picture of calm, objective rationality. They stand amidst the wreckage they secretly orchestrated, positioning themselves as the indispensable voice of reason and the only reliable anchor in a sea of manufactured madness. By weaponizing darkness and chaos, the psychopath ensures that the organization remains completely disoriented. The employees are too busy fighting artificial fires, navigating broken communication channels, and worrying about their own survival to notice the predator operating in plain sight. It is a masterful, devastating subversion of the corporate structure, transforming a place of business into a psychological war zone where the only victor is the one who wrote the rules of engagement. Chapter 8. I'm not a psychopath. I just talk and act like one. The midday sun reflects brightly off the glass exterior of an upscale restaurant where Dave sits across from a senior executive casually slicing into a premium steak. The conversation has turned toward an impending, brutal round of corporate downsizing. The executive, visibly burdened by the impending reality, admits to losing sleep over the families whose livelihoods are about to be shattered. Dave does not break eye contact. He sets down his knife and effortlessly adopts a mask of stern, uncompromising pragmatism. He speaks smoothly about trimming the fat, optimizing human capital, and making the hard calls. He frames the devastation of hundreds of careers not as a tragedy but as a necessary bold maneuver to ensure the company's survival. He exhibits absolutely no empathy, yet he expertly disguises this terrifying void by wrapping it in the universally accepted language of tough business acumen. To the exhausted executive sitting across the table, Dave does not look like a predator. He looks like a remarkably strong, decisive leader, capable of shouldering the emotional burdens that others are simply too weak to bear. This lunchtime interaction illuminates a pervasive and deeply complex challenge in identifying these individuals within a professional setting. In the modern, hyper-competitive global marketplace, aggressive, confrontational, and exceptionally ruthless behaviors are not only tolerated, they are frequently rewarded. A corporate culture that actively celebrates the killer instinct creates a highly dangerous overlap between legitimate, albeit harsh, management practices and actual psychopathic predation. Because of this confusing overlap, individuals are constantly mislabeled. It is incredibly easy for an employee who has been deeply wounded by a demanding boss or professionally undercut by a highly ambitious colleague to simply brand their tormentor as a psychopath. Yet, displaying toxic, difficult, or highly destructive behavior in the workplace does not automatically satisfy the rigorous clinical criteria required for a true diagnosis. There are countless reasons why a completely normal individual, someone possessing a fully functioning conscience and a genuine deep capacity for human connection, might suddenly exhibit behaviors that closely mimic the chilling traits of a psychopath. The most common catalyst for this behavioral shift is intense, unyielding environmental pressure. When an organization is facing financial ruin, or when an individual employee is subjected to an impossible workload and the constant, looming threat of termination, their psychological defenses begin to crack. They may become intensely irritable, make highly impulsive decisions, snap viciously at their colleagues, or even engage in deceptive practices simply to survive another fiscal quarter. This is a stress response, a temporary, desperate survival mechanism born of sheer panic. It is not a fundamental, structural defect of their personality. Once the suffocating pressure of the environment is alleviated, their normal empathetic baseline almost always returns. Furthermore, corporate culture itself can actively train normal people to act like predators. If an organization historically promotes and richly compensates managers who publicly humiliate their staff, who ruthlessly steal credit from their subordinates, and who treat employees purely as disposable, highly depreciable assets, ambitious junior staff will naturally study and mirror these behaviors. They adopt a highly toxic management style not because they inherently lack a conscience, but because they believe, often correctly, that it is the only viable path to success within that specific poisoned ecosystem. They learn to tightly compartmentalize their empathy, effectively leaving their morals at the door when they enter the building. They may act like cold, calculating, and ruthless machines while in the boardroom, yet return home to be deeply loving parents and fiercely loyal friends. The psychopath, by stark contrast, possesses no ability to compartmentalize. They are the exact same hollow, remorseless, and predatory entity sitting at the head of the boardroom table as they are sitting at their own dinner table. Another significant source of misidentification stems from profound professional burnout, particularly among those serving in caregiving, human resources, or executive leadership roles. When professionals are continuously, relentlessly exposed to high-stakes conflict, severe emotional trauma, or the highly draining necessity of constantly terminating employees, they can easily develop severe compassion fatigue. To protect their own psychological well-being from complete collapse, they instinctively build massive, impenetrable emotional walls. They begin to speak exclusively in clinical, highly detached jargon. They may appear entirely unfeeling and robotic when delivering devastating news. To an outside observer, this profound emotional detachment looks exactly like the chilling callousness of a true psychopath. However, the underlying mechanism is entirely different. The burned-out professional is shutting down because they are feeling too much. The psychopath is perfectly calm because they feel absolutely nothing at all. This dangerous intersection of toxic corporate environments and professional obligation becomes most vivid when examining those who are explicitly sworn to protect others. Within every functional society, there exists an implicit covenant, a professional oath. This can be highly explicit, such as the oath taken by medical professionals, or implicitly understood, such as the strict ethical obligations of human resources directors, corporate auditors, and legal counsel. These individuals are intentionally designated as the institutional guardians of integrity and the ultimate protectors of the organization's people. Yet, a profound crisis emerges when the culture of the organization aggressively demands that these guardians completely abandon their fundamental principles in the name of corporate survival or executive greed. In environments dominated by highly aggressive, ethically compromised leadership, these guardians are frequently forced into a devastating, soul-crushing compromise. A human resources director, whose primary mandate is employee welfare, might receive a direct, inescapable order from the executive board to orchestrate a legally dubious, highly punitive termination of a whistleblower. To refuse this order is to forfeit their own livelihood and career. When they eventually execute the directive, adopting a cold, bureaucratic, and highly rigid demeanor to shield themselves from the profound moral injury of the act, they completely betray the very essence of their professional mandate. Their foundational oath becomes entirely hypocritical. They are forced against their will to act as the unfeeling executioner for a toxic regime, utilizing the sterile language of corporate policy and standard procedure to effectively sanitize a fundamentally unjust and abusive act. For the true psychopath operating within the organization, this widespread, systemic moral compromise provides the ultimate, impenetrable camouflage. When the entire corporate environment is deeply infected with aggressive, borderline unethical behavior, when fierce shouting matches are normalized, when blatant deceit is smoothly reframed as strategic positioning, and when the designated ethical guardians are transformed into mere enforcers for the executive suite, the psychopath's own highly predatory actions blend in with absolute perfection. They are no longer a glaring, terrifying anomaly. They are simply a highly successful, exceptionally well-adapted product of their environment. By hiding effortlessly behind the accepted, aggressive jargon of the modern business world, and by pointing directly to the compromised, callous actions of their own colleagues as justification, they confidently declare to the world that they are not a monster. They insist, with absolute conviction, that they are simply doing exactly what it takes to win the game. Chapter 9. Enemy at the gates. The illusion is occasionally tested. Inside a quiet conference room, Dave sits opposite Frank and a senior human resources representative. A glaring discrepancy has surfaced regarding a massive budget shortfall on a project Dave supposedly managed. The atmosphere is tense. The evidence of financial mismanagement is sitting directly on the table. A normal employee would be sweating, stumbling over their words, or paralyzed by the fear of impending termination. Dave, however, is entirely relaxed. He leans forward, his posture open and inviting, and looks the human resources director squarely in the eyes. With a warm, slightly self-deprecating chuckle, he launches into a breathtakingly complex, yet entirely plausible, explanation. He weaves a masterful narrative involving shifting corporate directives, a sudden change in international vendor pricing, and the unfortunate incompetence of an administrative assistant who has already left the company. He then seamlessly transitions from defense to offense, pivoting to complement the human resources director on her sharp eye and rigorous oversight, suggesting they should collaborate more closely in the future. In less than 15 minutes, the tension in the room completely evaporates. Frank breathes a sigh of relief, the HR director smiles warmly, and the doubts simply dance away. Dave walks out of the room not with a reprimand, but with an apology for the misunderstanding. The ease with which this deception occurs highlights the most critical vulnerability in the corporate fortress, the gateway. Once a psychopathic individual has bypassed the perimeter and established a foothold within the organization, extracting them becomes a monumental, highly destructive undertaking. Therefore, the absolute best defense is a fiercely guarded gate. The hiring and interviewing process must be transformed from a simple meet and greet into a rigorous, impenetrable screening mechanism designed specifically to filter out the corporate predator. This defense begins with a fundamental shift in the power dynamic of the interview room. The interviewer must absolutely retain control of the interview. A psychopath enters an interview with a very specific, highly practiced agenda. They intend to hijack the conversation, steering it away from hard facts and verifiable achievements and turning it into a theatrical performance designed to dazzle and disarm. They will attempt to establish a false intimacy, asking personal questions of the interviewer, making witty observations, and dominating the airspace with grandiose stories. The seasoned interviewer must recognize this tactic immediately and aggressively pull the conversation back to the structured script. Structure is the enemy of the psychopath. When the conversation is forced to remain on strict, verifiable professional ground, their charm offensive is neutralized and the glaring gaps in their actual qualifications begin to widen. To expose these gaps, organizations must move beyond the traditional reliance on polished resumes and charismatic conversation. They must actively ask for work samples. The psychopath is an exceptional talker, possessing a mesmerizing verbal fluency that can easily convince an audience of their profound expertise. However, they are fundamentally averse to actual grinding labor. When an applicant claims to have single-handedly designed a revolutionary software platform or authored a comprehensive market strategy, the organization must demand to see the code, review the written reports, or require the candidate to complete a rigorous real-time technical assessment. When forced to produce tangible, verifiable evidence of their claimed brilliance, the psychopath will frequently stumble, offering a barrage of excuses regarding confidentiality agreements or lost hard drives. These excuses must be recognized not as minor inconveniences, but as massive, flashing red flags. Furthermore, the questions asked during the interview must be fundamentally restructured. Vague theoretical questions such as "How do you handle conflict?" or "What is your greatest weakness?" are utterly useless when dealing with a highly skilled liar. The psychopath has perfectly rehearsed, universally appealing answers to these standard inquiries. Instead, the interviewer must focus intensely on behavior. They must demand highly specific, granular examples of past performance. Tell me about a specific time a major project failed under your leadership. What were the exact steps you took to rectify it, and how did you manage the emotional fallout within your team? Because the psychopath fundamentally lacks genuine experience in collaborative problem-solving and possesses no true empathy, they struggle immensely to construct detailed, internally consistent behavioral narratives on the spot. Their answers will often remain frustratingly vague, or they will inadvertently reveal a highly punitive, dismissive attitude toward their former subordinates. While analyzing these behavioral answers, the interviewer must remain highly attuned to the emotional disconnect. This is the subtle, highly disturbing space where the psychopath's mask briefly slips. Because they do not actually experience human emotion, they are merely simulating it. A sharp observer can often detect a profound incongruity between the horrifying or tragic nature of a story and the candidate's physical reaction. They might describe a massive, devastating round of layoffs that destroyed hundreds of families, yet their voice remains entirely flat. Or worse, they might exhibit a faint, inappropriate smile. They may use highly charged emotional language, but their eyes remain cold, calculating, and completely unengaged. This chilling disconnect is the biological signature of the predator, the absolute absence of a conscience revealing itself in a microscopic fraction of a second. To ensure these fleeting moments are captured, it is absolutely essential that the interviewer take notes. The human memory is incredibly malleable, easily distorted by charm, physical attractiveness, and a dominant personality. An interviewer might leave a session feeling profoundly impressed by a candidate, completely unable to articulate exactly why. Taking detailed, rigorous notes during the interview forces the conscious mind to stay anchored to the actual data. When the interviewer reviews the transcript later, stripped of the candidate's hypnotic physical presence and vocal intonations, the illusion frequently shatters. The grand, sweeping statements that sounded so visionary in the room suddenly read as completely hollow, illogical, and entirely devoid of actual substance. Perhaps the most crucial defensive strategy is a structural one. Do not decide alone. The psychopath is a master of the one-on-one interaction. They possess the uncanny ability to rapidly assess a single individual's vulnerabilities and construct a perfectly tailored persona to exploit them. However, it is exponentially more difficult to simultaneously manipulate a room full of people possessing entirely different personalities, professional priorities, and personal insecurities. The panel interview is a formidable barrier. While the psychopath is intensely focused on charming the senior executive in the room, the silent human resources representative sitting in the corner is carefully observing the emotional disconnect, the subtle micro-expressions of contempt, and the evasive behavioral answers. This rigorous, multi-layered defense is absolutely necessary because the motivation driving these individuals is terrifyingly pure. They do not view the corporation as a place of employment or a community of shared endeavor. They view it as a massive, unguarded vault. There is a chilling mindset perfectly encapsulated by the phrase, "Please God, help me plunder." This is not an exaggeration. It is the literal, unspoken prayer of the corporate psychopath as they walk through the front doors. They are seeking an environment rich in resources, heavily populated with trusting, vulnerable targets, and completely lacking in rigorous oversight. They intend to extract maximum wealth, power, and entertainment, entirely unconcerned with the smoking crater they will inevitably leave behind. Putting it all together requires a massive, unwavering commitment from the highest levels of the organization. Background checks must be exhaustive, forensic examinations of a candidate's history, not simply a quick verification of employment dates. Reference checks must systematically bypass the carefully curated list of supporters provided by the candidate, actively seeking out former peers and subordinates who have witnessed the unmasked reality of the individual's behavior. The gate must be heavily fortified with structure, skepticism, and a profound understanding of exactly what the organization is trying to keep out. If the organization allows the sheer pressure of filling a vacancy or the blinding glare of manufactured charisma to bypass these critical defenses, they are not merely making a bad hire, they are willingly inviting the enemy straight into the heart of the citadel. Chapter 10. Protecting Yourself and the Organization. The carefully constructed walls of isolation finally begin to crack. Deep within the corporate labyrinth, small, hesitant conversations start taking place behind closed doors. Frank, weary from the constant underlying tension and increasingly suspicious of the shifting narratives, discreetly reaches out to a former colleague whom Dave had aggressively marginalized. Across the building, the human resources director, nagged by the subtle inconsistencies in Dave's behavioral interview answers and a growing file of quietly distressed employee resignations, begins to compare notes with the auditing department. They are circling the wagons. The moment these disparate individuals breach the artificial barriers erected by the psychopath and begin to share their isolated fragments of reality, the magnificent, terrifying puzzle begins to unravel. The illusion of the brilliant, indispensable executive shatters, revealing the cold, calculating void of the predator underneath. Yet, arriving at this realization is only the beginning of a highly perilous extraction process. The ultimate defense against such a predator, whether on a personal or an organizational level, relies heavily on proactive fortification long before the crisis reaches a breaking point. For the individual professional, self-defense starts with a profoundly uncomfortable internal audit. To protect against a creature whose primary weapon is psychological manipulation, one must be intimately aware of their own hot buttons and weak spots. The psychopath is a master hacker of the human emotional code. They search relentlessly for insecurities, unfulfilled ambitions, deep-seated vanities, or hidden professional resentments. If an employee is desperately seeking a mentor, craving validation for their unrecognized genius, or harboring a quiet bitterness toward upper management, the psychopath will instantly adopt the perfect persona to exploit that exact emotional hunger. Recognizing your own vulnerabilities and maintaining a healthy, realistic assessment of your professional value is the first vital layer of armor against manufactured flattery and artificial bonding. Beyond self-awareness, the most potent personal defense is the maintenance of an absolutely unassailable professional reputation. The psychopath thrives on destroying the credibility of their detractors. If a targeted employee has a history of engaging in office gossip, producing erratic work, or participating in petty workplace conflicts, the psychopath will effortlessly amplify these flaws, framing the victim as an unstable, disgruntled worker. However, a professional who consistently delivers high-quality work, maintains a calm, objective demeanor, and strictly avoids office politics is incredibly difficult to discredit. Their steadfast reputation acts as a heavy anchor, making it nearly impossible for the psychopath to suddenly paint them as a chaotic or incompetent force. Coupled with a strong reputation is the absolute necessity of meticulous documentation. The psychopath operates entirely in the shadows of verbal agreements, subtle insinuations, and deliberate misdirection. They will issue contradictory instructions, quietly change project parameters, and deny ever having made critical promises. The only effective countermeasure to this relentless gaslighting is an unwavering commitment to the written record. Every directive, every agreed-upon metric, and every seemingly casual project pivot must be immediately confirmed and codified in writing. This paper trail serves as an impervious shield. When the inevitable project collapse occurs and the psychopath attempts to shift the blame, the victim possesses the exact time-stamped reality, effectively neutralizing the predator's ability to rewrite history. Furthermore, because the psychopath actively seeks to isolate their targets, survival depends on building and maintaining a robust, authentic rapport with colleagues across all levels of the organization. A professional who is deeply connected to their peers, who treats the administrative staff with the same respect as the executive board, and who fosters genuine reciprocal trust possesses an invaluable early warning system. When the psychopath begins their subtle campaign of character assassination, these authentic networks hold firm. The isolated, vulnerable employee is easy prey. The deeply connected, highly respected colleague represents a formidable, often impenetrable target. As the personal defensive perimeter is established, the focus must inevitably shift outward to the macro level. The presence of these individuals in the modern workplace is not a series of isolated, unfortunate hiring mistakes. It represents a profound, systemic vulnerability within the architecture of global business. It is the emergence of a fifth column. In military terms, a fifth column is a clandestine group that works from within to sabotage a nation or organization, completely subverting its defenses and preparing the ground for total collapse. The corporate psychopath operates precisely in this manner. They wear the uniform of the company, they possess the security clearances, and they speak the language of corporate loyalty, all while secretly draining the organization's financial resources, devastating its human capital, and actively working to enrich themselves at the cost of the company's very survival. The tragic reality is that the hyper-accelerated, profit-obsessed nature of the modern business world frequently acts as an unwitting accomplice to this fifth column. By prioritizing aggressive short-term financial gains over long-term stability, and by increasingly tolerating ruthlessness as a necessary component of leadership, organizations have inadvertently rolled out the red carpet for intraspecies predators. The behaviors that define psychopathy, a complete lack of remorse, pathological lying, emotional poverty, and a purely exploitative view of human relationships, are incredibly destructive. Yet, when heavily sanitized and rebranded as strategic maneuvering, hard-nosed leadership, and visionary disruption, they are readily bought and sold in the executive marketplace. Until the global corporate culture undergoes a fundamental paradigm shift, learning to differentiate between genuine, ethical leadership and the highly polished, destructive mimicry of the psychopath, the fifth column will continue to thrive inside the gates. Back in the labyrinth, the net finally closes in on Dave. Armed with a meticulously documented paper trail, unified witness testimonies, and the irrefutable evidence of financial diversion, Frank and the human resources team present their findings to the executive board. The sheer magnitude of the deception leaves the senior leaders stunned. The rise has reached its absolute peak, and the fall is imminent. However, the fall of the corporate psychopath rarely resembles the satisfying cinematic justice society craves. Confronted with absolute proof of their destruction, Dave does not break down, confess, or exhibit a single ounce of remorse. Instead, he assesses the room with cold, calculating detachment. He instantly recognizes that while the executives are furious, they are fundamentally terrified of the public humiliation, the shareholder panic, and the potential legal liabilities that a massive public scandal would ignite. Leveraging this exact fear, Dave executes his final, masterful manipulation. He calmly negotiates a quiet resignation. In exchange for his immediate departure and a promise of silence, the deeply compromised organization agrees to provide him with a generous severance package and, chillingly, a neutral or even positive letter of recommendation. Dave packs his few personal belongings into a leather briefcase. He walks past the devastated teams, the derailed careers, and the fractured trust he leaves behind, feeling absolutely nothing. He steps into the elevator, adjusts his impeccably tailored suit in the mirrored doors, and walks out into the bright afternoon sun, fully funded, highly credentialed, and perfectly prepared to find his next opportunity. The organization survives, deeply scarred and fundamentally changed by the encounter, finally understanding the true cost of confusing a magnetic illusion with genuine human substance.